Thank you very much, Adrian. We may now pass to our expert briefing, and I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Heidi Hellis, who is an associate professor in psychology and psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital, as well as a licensed clinical psychologist. Dr. Hellis is also the director of the Refugee Trauma and Resilience Center at Boston Children's Hospital and a partner in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Dr. Hellis' primary focus is on understanding and promoting refugee youth mental health and well-being, with a particular emphasis on understanding how trauma exposure, violence, and the social context impact developmental trajectories. Over the past 15 years, she has conducted a community-based participatory research program with Somali youth and was principal investigator of a multi-site longitudinal research project examining developmental pathways to and away from violence, including ideological violence, gang involvement, and constructive civic engagement. Dr. Hellis is currently co-leading a multidisciplinary expert resource group on the topic of repatriation and reintegration of children from formerly IS-controlled territories, and is also the co-developer of the trauma treatment model, trauma system therapy. Heidi and Emma, it is an immense pleasure to have you with us, and thank you very much for the time that you are dedicating to this discussion. You may start with your presentation at any time.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction and for sharing your time with us for the next hour or so. So as Cecilia was saying, my roots really come from focusing on child trauma. Emma and I are both clinical child psychologists with an emphasis on trauma. And it was really in that context that I actually first started working with Somali youth and realized how important it was to understand how to address the trauma they were experiencing, as well as the social context in which they were living, which in the United States, there were high levels of discrimination and social context that really impacted their functioning. So I began almost 20 years ago doing research in partnership with the Somali community and using a community-based participatory research approach, so in really genuine partnerships with the Somali community. And it was during the time that I was deeply embedded in researching trauma, discrimination, and mental health with young Somalis that Somali youth from Minneapolis ended up joining Al-Shabaab. And it sounds like that was a topic that you all were discussing last week. So that became, we expanded our longitudinal research to ask questions around what might have led to their engagement or decision to leave, what is related to more generally in the population attitudes that might be in support or opposed to violent activism. And it really launched a second line of our work, which has been around trying to understand exactly what you're talking about. Why might children or youth become engaged in extremist violence? And what can we do to think about ushering them out of that and re-engaging them in healthy communities. So that work has really continued to evolve. Last fall, I had the opportunity to go to Kyrgyzstan, Kosovo, and North Macedonia to observe where each of those countries were in their process of repatriating and reintegrating children who had spent time in ISIS-controlled territories. When I was there, Kosovo was the only country who had already brought children back. North Macedonia and Kyrgyzstan were both in the process of determining how they would do that, what needed to be in place. And it was really a moment that brought together for me my long-term passion and understanding about child trauma and how you work with traumatized children to help them, and this question of preventing violent extremism. And so as those two streams sort of have come together around this issue, Emma and I have both been working closely with a number of people, Mia Bloom, Steve Wine. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of either of them, Eric Rosent, but we've been really sorting through how can we pull from what we know, long history of research in child development and psychology around child trauma, as well as the emerging research around violent extremism, to put together a very practical approach to supporting repatriation and reintegration of children from ISIS. So that's where I will be focusing my talk today, but I'm also happy to kind of delve into some of those other areas that we've been a part of in the past. So I'm going to attempt a share screen here. Host disabled participant screen sharing. So not sure if you want to share, Cecilia, or if you can enable me to share.
Couldn't you access the share screen feature on the bottom?
When I click share screen, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay.
So maybe I need to create a host.
Now it should be working.
Okay, we'll try again. Oh yes, that works. Okay. All right. Can you see that now?
Not yet.
Not yet. All right. Let me see if I can figure out why. Do you see it yet?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Sorry, just making sure. There we go. Okay, so when we talk about the trauma that kids living in ISIS-controlled territories endured, we're talking about a multi-layered, severe, pervasive presence of trauma. Save the Children conducted a study of children who lived in Al-Hol and had spent time in ISIS-controlled territories. And here is some of what they found. Kids have been witness to daily acts of severe violence, including killings. They've seen dead bodies in the streets, bombs falling on homes. They've experienced extreme deprivation, so going without food or water, the loss of loved ones, and that often also includes witnessing the violent deaths of loved ones, and really what I would describe as a collective trauma, where a whole community and society has endured that, and there are the consequences then of how trauma affects other people in the community, including parents, and we do know that there's often an uptick in domestic violence in conflict settings. The sources of threat that children may have experienced under ISIS control spans multiple levels of the social ecology. So within the family, some may have experienced their parents as protectors, but for others, the parents themselves may have been sources of threat. As I mentioned, domestic violence and child abuse increases in conflict settings. Children also regularly experience loss or separation from parents, and this occurring at a time when they likely were feeling particularly vulnerable, and may also have witnessed their parents be terrified and helpless. At the level of schools, schools integrated a K-12 curriculum that was really imbued with violence, so that even a math class used images of bombs or destruction to illustrate concepts. So I've seen, some of the pages of textbooks might have time telling, but the clocks are each affixed to a time bomb. So the very process of learning is steeped in violence. And at the societal level, children were exposed to ongoing conflict and war, public executions, and widespread resource deprivation. So unquestionably, we need to grapple with this question. What does this mean for successful reintegration and rehabilitation? To answer this question, I want to start with basic neuroscience behind trauma, just to sort of level set all of us and how we think about that. Then briefly present some of my own research on trauma and radicalization. And then finally take a step back to think about how all of this relates to successful reintegration and rehabilitation programming. While I will talk specifically about issues related to reintegration of children, much of what I will say may also be relevant for returning women or men as well. Our brains are exquisitely designed to promote survival in the face of threat. The amygdala is the part of the brain responsible for helping us to respond to threat, and it does so by activating our survival systems, which typically is a fight, flight, or freezing response. This is incredibly adaptive when we are faced with real danger, but when a child lives in an environment of chronic or severe threat, the amygdala can become potentiated, meaning that it begins to respond as if it is facing a true threat, even in settings that are relatively safe. What this means is that you can take a child out of an unsafe setting, like Al-Hol, and reintegrate them to a much safer context, but their brains may continue to respond to minor stressors in the environment as if their survival is at stake. Within the family setting, resource strain or maternal mental health problems can create sources of stress and perceived threat. Children may also experience ideological or acculturative conflict when living with families that reject ISIS teachings. And within school, this is all in the resettlement context, within school, children may have experienced significant disruptions to their education as a result of their experiences and may have learning difficulties, developmental delays, or both. They may also show social skills deficits that result in biases towards perceiving interactions as threatening. And again, all of this culminates in school being a place of insecurity, fear, and perceived threat, rather than a safe and comfortable learning environment. Finally, within society, these children and their families may experience stigma and discrimination, which can lead to perceived or even real threats to their safety. So across the levels of the social ecology, children may continue to experience their environment as threatening, even after resettlement. And this in turn can manifest in a range of dysregulated behaviors. Trauma can manifest in a wide range of ways, impacting someone's emotions, their behavior, and how they even perceive and process themselves and the world around them. Over time, you can get what are called developmental cascades. Whoops, sorry, give me a minute. Okay. Over time, you can get what we call developmental cascades. If trauma is left untreated, then disrupted functioning in one area begins to affect the normal developmental trajectories. So you can end up with a cascade of disruptions across multiple domains. So this is one hypothetical developmental cascade. And I put this up here not to forecast that this is what these kids are headed for, but to make 2 points. One, what starts as a trauma response in the brain can have long-term multifaceted consequences if kids don't get the support and treatment they need. So 2, we need to be in the game of prevention. We need to be doing everything we can to get in early and turn the ship around so that instead of a cascade of problems, we can see a cascade of positive growth. So in this hypothetical scenario, you might see the trauma relating to a child's increased experience of fear, hypervigilance, and nightmares. That in turn can lead to poor attention, disrupted learning, and social withdrawal, which also can relate to loneliness, lagging social skills, poor self-esteem, and ultimately school failure. That can contribute to family conflict. Parents may be upset that the child is not managing well at school. They may experience depression. Ultimately, they could drop out of school. And as we can imagine, that would leave that youth very vulnerable to antisocial outcomes. So the point here is really when we start talking about trauma, we can't just say, oh, trauma affects the brain and mental health. If it's untreated, trauma can affect multiple domains over time in ways that become much harder to turn around. Okay, so how do we intervene early in a way that can actually change this? The best answer to that question that I know has come from decades of work in child development and is based on the idea that a child is part of a social ecology. Whatever strengths or problems they have at the individual level interact with layers of the social ecology around them, for better or for worse. They live in families, they go to school, they're part of communities and neighborhoods, and at the broadest level, they're part of a larger nation. So disruptions in any one layer of the social ecology can have profound effects on the developing child at its core. Think for a minute about the kinds of stressors that kids may be facing in the process of reintegration. You might see at the individual level, as we mentioned, they may have developmental delays, lagging skills, or mental health problems. There's the adjustment to a new setting, a new culture, sometimes a new language. At the next level out in school, they may experience bullying, Within the family, there could be conflict. They might experience loss or separation from their parents. At the community and neighborhood level, often concerns around stigma have been raised. And then finally, at the largest level of culture and nation, these kids grew up in a very specific culture within ISIS, and were taught a set of values and a way of thinking that is often in conflict with the countries where they're resettling. And so there's a cultural conflict. Even if they're moving away from what they were taught, there's a period of adjustment and stress and conflict as they try to make sense of these divergent worlds. So there are disruptions at all these layers of the social ecology, which can negatively affect development. But if that's true, the inverse is also true, that within each layer of the social ecology, we have an opportunity to create positive growth for the child. So let me illustrate how this works from drawing from my research with Somali young adults that I had mentioned. So as I mentioned, a couple decades ago almost, I started working with Somali refugees in the US, running a community-based participatory research program to understand what promoted positive developmental trajectories among youth who had experienced significant trauma and disruption. When midway into the research, a number of Somalis left the US to join al-Shabaab and later ISIS, I realized that our research team needed to also understand why some youth were vulnerable to extremist ideas when the vast majority were not. One of the first things we looked at was trauma. And in fact, we found that having experienced more trauma was associated with a greater support for the use of violence for political change. But, and I want you to remember the picture of that social ecology here, this was only true for those who felt stigmatized in their communities or who felt disconnected from the US. So what you can see here, two graphs where if you look at just the bottom one, you can see across the bottom is trauma count. So further to the right means more experiences of trauma. And going up the y-axis, you have their attitudes towards support for violent extremism. So a higher score means more support for violent radicalization. And then the two lines represent a sense of how important the US, their country of resettlement, was to them, or a sense of belonging. And what you can see is that for those who felt like they really were embedded and belonged within the United States, trauma didn't make a difference in terms of their support for violent extremism. But for those who felt alienated in some way, felt different, ashamed, outside of society, additional trauma was associated with additional support for violent radicalization. So here you can really see that interaction between the way not just the individual and the trauma they experienced, but how that interacts with something larger outside of them, such as their sense of connection to the country that they live in. So fast forward a few years to a much larger longitudinal study of Somalis in the US and Canada. And again, we found that trauma was associated with more support for violent radicalism, but other experiences in the social environment, like experiencing your government as just or feeling a positive attachment to the US or Canada, were protective. So within our study sample, we found that the way, within our study sample, we found that the way trauma played out in relation to one very specific outcome, here views on violent extremism, was shaped by the levers at the furthest out layer of the social ecology, at the level of government and community. In the intervention trauma systems therapy, which is an intervention that I co-developed and Emma has been very involved in disseminating both in the US and Canada. So within that intervention trauma systems therapy, we like to talk about how when you think about trauma using a socio-ecological lens, it multiplies your intervention opportunities. Because we can work not only from the inside out by providing mental health care to the child, but also from the outside in by thinking about how to build positive experiences throughout the social environment. I'm going to briefly share with you what the treatment model trauma systems therapy looks like. Although this particular trauma model It's not been implemented with returning children. In fact, very few models have been implemented because it's a new issue. We have a good deal of experience using this treatment model with refugee children, and I think it offers a concrete approach to implementing many of the guidelines that are now consistently recommended in R&R best practices, including a multidisciplinary approach to supporting children. So TST is a treatment model that was developed to explicitly address signals of threat in the social environment and the problematic response patterns they bring about. So both stress in the social environment as well as emotional dysregulation. TST was designed around the needs of children who have experienced or are experiencing significant multi-level traumas and who contend with considerable environmental stressors: war, displacement, community violence, domestic violence, resource hardships, family conflict, among them. Specifically, TST provides a specific psychosocial intervention approach to reducing environmental stressors and signals of threat, there we go, and addressing a child's emotional and behavioral dysregulation and distorted cognitions related to the self, others, and the world around him or her. And all of this is done using a multidisciplinary team approach to addressing interrelated needs across multiple domains of development. The TST treatment model is a phase-based approach with the focus of treatment changing depending on the level of stability in the social environment and the degree to which the child is capable of regulating. So, and just to make that very concrete, if you think of, if you're familiar with many of the empirically based trauma models that are in use in the United States or elsewhere, a typical one might be trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which would be very appropriate for a child who experienced a car accident and continues to have flashbacks. But let's say that kid lives in a stable family, they go to school, but that's a good fit for them. There's no ongoing violence in their environment, but they have an experience of trauma that is really impacting their emotion regulation. You would want to focus on processing the trauma. Now, you can imagine if you're working with a child who is a refugee, who has recently resettled, is in a family where there's a great deal of stress and resource uncertainty, goes to a school where they don't feel safe because they're being teased, they don't understand the context, perhaps they're living in a place where there's domestic violence. This is a very different situation. And so trying to focus on processing trauma, it may not be the right approach. You really need to start by thinking about stabilizing the social environment, getting in there, making sure the child experiences safety, feels safe, and has the appropriate supports around him or her to be able to move towards building regulation skills and addressing the trauma. So what we have done is we've pulled from trauma models that have been out there before, but we've really embedded them in a much more comprehensive assessment and intervention of the social environment so that we can be thinking about the stressors as well as the individual child's regulation. As we think about building successful reintegration and rehabilitation programs, Emma and I have gone through the process of taking the 3 phases of trauma systems therapy and thinking about how they would translate to working with children who are in the repatriation and reintegration process. I'm not going to go through these slides because there's a lot of content, but as you can see, the intervention goal, target, and approach shifts slightly as children move towards a more stable environment and a better set of regulation skills. And one you would take on then some of the different developmental problems that we talked about in that developmental cascade as the children move through the phases of treatment. We have summarized all this in both a manuscript that's in-depth and currently under review, but also a 4-page, 3-page brief. And I'm happy to share that with people if they're interested, and that provides a bit more overview of the different phases and how it would look. So as we think about building successful reintegration and rehabilitation programs for children who have spent time under ISIS, we need to be doing 2 things. We need to be thinking about the kinds of stressors they might encounter in the social environment, and then we need to systematically work to reduce them. And these are some of the stressors I'll walk through. And then we need to be thinking about the ways that we can build safety, acceptance, and cohesion across the social ecology. So some of the stressors that we've identified, we looked at already. Opportunities for building safe, cohesive, and accepting communities land in all of those layers as well. So we can think about providing mental health care and developmental support at the individual level, bullying prevention, support for academic success at the school level, thinking about how do we support families and address issues that might arise like family conflict. How do we at the community and neighborhood level take a proactive approach to address stigma and increase cohesion so that there's a better national understanding of why children are being repatriated and why that is not necessarily a risk to their communities. And then finally, at the broadest level, thinking, and again, this is aspirational, but to the extent that governments can be engaging due process, providing opportunities for civic engagement, those factors will create opportunities for that kind of sense of trust and belonging that we found were so important when we were doing our research. So clearly, for a problem like what we're talking about, there's no silver bullet, but just as unattended trauma can lead to negative developmental cascades, we believe that a thoughtfully orchestrated program can lead to positive cascades and to successful reintegration and rehabilitation. And just briefly, I'll do a screen share of the best practices document that I was mentioning so that you know where it is. New share. Sorry, I'm still getting used to Zoom. There we go. Okay, do you see the best practices document?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, great. And again, I sent this to Cecilia, who can circulate it if people are interested. But briefly, we're able to kind of go through the purpose of what we're trying to do here. And I will say, I think there are a lot of really important guidelines and principles that have been put out. So we see OSCE, GCTF, a lot of groups have put out guidelines. What we felt like was missing was something a little step closer into the weeds of how do you actually operationalize some of those guidelines in a practical on-the-ground program. So this is a program that there's a manual to support it. There's past research efforts and intervention efforts showing how this can work, being adapted for different cultural groups. And it really specifies both the organization of how you put together a multidisciplinary team, but also the operations and the clinical goals, so that a clinician or a social worker who's coming into this team would have practical tools and know what to do session to session as they move forward in working with the family. So this is really what we felt like the purpose of this brief was, to take some of those guidelines and say, here's one model for how you could actually do that. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, that we are, continuing to have kids in Al Hol, maybe somewhere in the order of 7,000 to 10,000, and thinking about what do their experiences mean for their reintegration, as we talked about, and then very practically, what can we do to help? And this goes through the phases of treatment that I had mentioned under the trauma systems therapy model. So. Okay, with that, let me end my screen sharing and open it up for questions. And Emma, you can also jump in.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for your interesting presentation. We know particularly that today much of the international attention is turned towards the issue of children of foreign terrorist fighters who have been brought by their parents to Syria and Iraq. And we know that their condition is particularly concerning. Also, according to the most recent figures, more than 7,000 foreign children are being held in deteriorating condition in the Al Hol Annex camp in northern Syria, while several hundred more are in Ain Issa and Roj. And the 66% of foreign children are under the age of 18, Most of them are under the age of 12 or even under age 5 and are orphans or with parents missing. The status of these children is highly contentious because the perception of children in former IS territories or children formerly associated with the Islamic State are considered a serious security threat. And therefore, this perception imposes severe limitation on the capacity of these children to afford a system of protection that is prescribed by the rule of law with the corresponding legal architecture on child soldiering, but have also, most importantly, informed most of the decision making by their state of nationality with respect to repatriation. And so far, government level responses have been inconsistent, varying from a resistance to repatriation to a complete revocation of citizenship. However, we know that repatriation is widely regarded as the sole viable option to ensure child well-being and neutralize further security threat, as well as minimize their exposure to secondary victimization and human rights abuses in the camps also. Yeah. And in consideration of your study and your research, how do you think that by departing from an assessment of trauma and PTSD, we could support to reduce the stigma that these children experience and also repatriation?
I just want to make sure I understood your question. How, by departing from an assessment of trauma and PTSD, how could we support repatriation? So the way that I think about it is that trauma and PTSD may be a piece of it, but there's a much larger multidisciplinary approach that we need to take. And, you know, as you said, there's some governments have expressed concern about whether there's risk involved in with these youth, and you know that would be importing risk into the country. From the way I see it, is that a multidisciplinary team that can really effectively evaluate the broad range of psychosocial needs. They can look at trauma and mental health needs, but also, as I said, look at developmental lags or academic lags, look at potential risk behaviors, and do a thorough behaviorally based assessment of that. If we do that sort of comprehensive understanding of what is going on for a child, then we're able to really target treatment in an integrated way that is going to be much more effective than, you know, one agency over here dealing with trauma, one agency over here trying to monitor risk and looking in a different way at that. So you bring the pieces together and orchestrate a more coherent, cohesive response to the family, then it's both easier for the family and the child because it feels like a unified team approach, but it also is going to be much more effective. And trauma and PTSD may not be the primary issue for some kids. No doubt, many of them experience incredible trauma like we've talked about, but that can manifest in a huge range of effects on emotions, behavior, cognitions, development. And so simply saying we should treat PTSD is going to miss, it's like a tiny slice of what needs to be addressed, and taking a more comprehensive psychosocial assessment approach and building that more tailored multidisciplinary intervention in response, I think is what's going to be most effective. Emma, I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that.
No, I completely agree with what you said. I think I would just, the only thing I would really make clear is that, as Heidi was talking about before, right? She made mention of the extent to which there are developmental cascades. And that's something you really have to think about when you're thinking about the impact of trauma in childhood versus how it impacts an adult. The extent of those developmental cascades can be so broad sweeping, impacting a child across so many different domains, that as a result, per Heidi's point, you really need an intervention approach that's not just focused on trauma processing, because the impact is sweeping in so many ways across a child's development. So
the other part I would add there is doing that broad assessment also lets you assess for strengths so that you're not just focused on plugging the hole where the deficits are, but you're really saying, here's an area where this child is flourishing. This is a strength that they can bring to it. We can leverage this, and that can help, again, build that sort of reverse cascade. So if you have a child who maybe is struggling with a lot of emotional dysregulation, but they're really smart, that's an area to go in and say, okay, we want to build their sense of confidence and competence at school. We want to help them see that this is an area where they can move forward, and that's going to help them to begin to kind of feel more settled and be able to do the regulation work and advance into other areas where they may be lagging.
Thank you very much, Heidi and Emma. I see that Florence raised a hand. Florence, do you have any question?
Yes, I do, Cecilia. Thank you, Dr. Ellis, for a really, really comprehensive presentation. I'm a little bit familiar with the social ecological model, and it's great to see you explain it the way you did. My question is really generic, and it has to do with transitional justice and children. To what extent do you think that people being held accountable for crimes that they have committed, especially against children during armed conflict, can actually contribute to child resilience? You know, their ability to bounce back, their ability at least, well, not exactly to have a normal life, but how does that contribute to a child's development? And when I talk about a child here, perhaps I'll talk about somebody maybe between the age of 12 and 18. Yeah, so I don't know if you've had any research on this, but I know issues related to children and accountability over the past few years have not really been on the front burner when it comes to children and armed conflicts.
So I'm going to speak feeling not like an expert in this, but out of my knowledge of child development. And what I would say is, you know, part of what's happened for kids who've experienced really severe trauma is their sense of security and trust in those who are supposed to be caretaking around them has been shattered. So that includes, you know, government institutions or, you know, larger societal groups or adults in their community. And so if what you're talking about can help a youth to feel like it can help reestablish a sense of trust in that larger caregiving system around them, then I think that likely would be transformative in terms of their ability to heal. Emma, I hope you'll also speak, because I know you have a lot of experience in these things.
Oh, I'm not sure I have much to add to your response, Heidi. Florence, does that feel like that answers your question, or is there a piece of it that's still missing? I want to make sure I fully accurately understood your question as well before I continue the response.
I think there might be, maybe it's a very broad question, but I'm thinking about children who've been affected by armed conflict, right? And they are being reintegrated into society. However, whether or not they participate in transitional justice mechanisms, for example, if they're called to testify, or if they're called to be a part of a forum, you know, let us say at the local level, where, you know, those who were fighters come out and beg for forgiveness for the crimes, you know, they have committed, you know. I'm just wondering to what degree that actually affects a child's ability to deal with trauma, you know, to also help them kind of move forward. Because I know the psychology of a child is different from the psychology of an adult, you know, so I'm just really curious about that.
Yes, I understand your question. I think that's a really tough question to answer, in part because it depends on where the child is at in his or her healing journey when he or she might do something like, for example, being called to testify. You know, there's a way in which those experiences can feel for a child like an opportunity to gain mastery over something in which they felt they had very, very little agency over. Or it can feel in many ways re-traumatizing depending on the process and their own readiness for it. So I feel like I don't have a solid formulaic answer for you in the sense of here at this point, a child will experience something like that as a positive. It really depends on where that child is at in his or her development. Certainly for older children, I would say anecdotally, when you're talking about teenagers, they have the cognitive capacities to be able to participate in something like this and make sense of more abstract concepts and understand kind of nuances around morality and justice that a younger child wouldn't be able to, and therefore might then gain more from this experience. At the same time, I really do think it's dependent on the individual child's healing trajectory, what they've done thus far, and time of participation in the process. It's also dependent, as Heidi was talking about before, on kind of community level support around that child and how something like that is even structured by the community. Is it truly kind of reparative and restorative, or is it something else? What's the mission behind it? So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
I would just to add, when I mentioned there were 3 phases to the trauma systems therapy approach, the third and most advanced phase is called Beyond Trauma, and that's where we talk a lot about meaning making. And once a child is ready for that, often that there are ways that they can begin to make meaning out of their trauma, and this really comes out of Viktor Frankl's writing and his work. But for some, making meaning is also about, just what you're talking about. Is there a way to kind of to make right in some ways what the wrongs that they experienced, and to do that sometimes in a more public facing way can be very healing. But it's individualized, and it really, as Emma said, is embedded in an understanding of that child and what's going to help them personally move forward, and would not be appropriate for everyone at every stage.
The other thing that I would add, just to throw out there, is that I think it's also to some extent dependent a bit on trauma type too, right? And this could be a whole other conversation, but there are certain traumatic experiences that even talking about out loud in a public facing way could be really stigmatizing too. And it kind of depends on the community of reintegration and what we're talking about here. But for some kids who have experienced armed conflict and have witnessed certain things and been victimized themselves, some of what they've experienced might be in and of itself incredibly stigmatizing to talk about out loud. And I think that would be another factor to be thinking about in terms of what a community-wide initiative around something like this would look like and how to support these kids in reporting on those experiences.
Thank you, Heidi and Emma. I see that Bill from the Romeo Dallaire Child Soldier Initiative has a question. Bill, anytime.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, thank you. And Emma, appreciate this presentation. I read some work in grad school at the START Center with Susan Zmania and their C program, and we had some of the work there. And it was great to see your work going on here. We're working on a number of things, and we deal a lot, obviously, with children recruited and used as soldiers as our main effort. But we're also, I'm managing a project from the Molson Foundation here in Canada on looking at that in a domestic context with and one of the places that we're starting from is the issue of former child soldiers who then immigrate to Canada. They're under regular immigration or refugee or asylum programs. So that's issues that we're looking at, but there's also the issue in terms of adverse childhood experience with children in Canada who are exposed to armed violence. And I'm trying to have a bit of an understanding, because a lot of the work on childhood violence, if I'm correct, I'm not a psychologist or anything, but has with domestic violence, witnessing intimate partner violence. There is some witnessing community violence and experiencing things, bullying, but I haven't seen a lot about kids that grow up and who are exposed to armed violence in North American context. And there, I would suspect that there's a fact if you're 3 months or 6 months old and there's constantly gunfire at night, whether that's in South Sudan or South Vancouver, you're experiencing that. It's affecting your sleep patterns. It's affecting many things around your life. So are there consistencies in that, or parallels to be drawn on, but in terms of armed violence? Now, I don't know if the scale of violence is the same thing, but a bully threatening to beat someone is not the same thing as someone pulling out a gun and threatening them. So I don't know if the exposure to violence is nuanced. Maybe it's overstating it. But that's you, and children exposed to violence, and then the trauma that comes with it would be very rare. And what we're looking at specifically, because we look at how security sector actors interact with children. So children whose decision making is cognitively stunted, their development is stunted, their death complex become developed, and so procedures that soldiers are trained in to deal with an area, or police in dealing with an adult, may not work with children. The example I give is I served tours in Afghanistan. So when you come up, there's an enemy force there, there's more guns and more tanks, and they count, and they say, okay, got more, so we'll stand down. Child may not. A child may not make the same benefit analysis. And I'm being very simplistic, and I very much apologize for that, but I teach soldiers this, and I need to teach this in terms that they understand, not understand, right? Because they're the ones who will come across these children, as will police. So we're trying to, you have to rethink your procedures because you worked in that case no longer works. Same way you're dealing with landmines no longer applies to IEDs because they have been changed and manipulated. You have to learn new techniques. You have to learn non-escalation. You have to learn all of these things. Your posture and profile has to change, right, as you go through this. So that's why I'm trying to draw out these parallels for armed conflict and armed violence. The other thing I would like to hear about is we're a lot about reintegration, but with a number of children in 7,000, many of them were born in Syria. So we're not reintegrating them into North America. We're integrating them, right? But they don't know this society, nothing but conflict. So people say, well, reintegrating, well, actually, so is this a different process? Do we have to say, okay, well, we're reintegrating the adults who came from America, fair enough, where, with the, the alternative bibs and things like that, breaking those things down. But what do we do with children who never knew, who have never known any except Raqqa? So those are my two things. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bill. There was a little bit of disruption to the line, so I think I got what you said, but if I've misunderstood something, hopefully you can clarify. So I think your first question was a really important one around, do we essentially have, we have kids exposed to armed conflict here in the United States, and I'm in the community violence and the gang context, and can we be, is that the same or is it different? What are the parallels there? And Emma actually led a paper that was looking at gang violence and extremist violence and how children were recruited in each of those settings. Emma, if you'd like to talk a little bit about what you found in that paper. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it essentially reinforced this idea of we need to understand how the social ecology is working. And what you see is that in both of those cases, there are a lot of parallels. And there are impacts and forces operating at those different layers of the social ecology that are essentially leading to children being recruited into those violent groups. On the other hand, how exactly those groups are operating in the different levels of the social ecology differs. And so, there's some nuance on that level. I would say at the level of trauma, I think the ACEs study that you referenced certainly talks about and I mean, it's a very powerful way of understanding adversities, many different types of adversities. You start stacking them up and the cumulative impact is enormous. I think, you know, there are some nuances around interpersonal violence versus maybe a natural disaster or some other sort of violence that doesn't have that interpersonal flavor. And that, you know, certainly impacts how I would think about working with a child, because as I mentioned earlier, kind of thinking about that trust in the caregiving system or the failure therein, you know, can certainly impact how a child is relating to the world. But on a very basic kind of physiological level, trauma and adversity impacts the same brain systems. Emma, do you want to jump in and speak to any of that?
Just to confirm, Cecilia, we only have 4 minutes left, right? Is that right? We go to 1:30?
No, it's 2 p.m.
Oh, okay. All right. I was just going to say, if so, then I'm really going to try and keep this
No
very
worries about it.
succinct. Well, we can certainly share that paper that Heidi was referencing, and that paper is really comparing, actually, you know, children who've grown up exposed to violent extremist organizations and children who've grown up in gangs, more vis-a-vis Central America, right? Which is also a whole other context. And Bill, I believe your question was like very specific to kind of what's going on in North America, right? And children's exposure to gun violence in that context, is that right?
Yes, in a non-armed conflict situation.
Yeah, yeah. So I will say that a colleague of ours, actually through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, does a lot of really interesting work in this area. His name is Brad Stolbach. And he refers to children who are gang involved really as America's child soldiers for a reason. And he talks a lot about the parallel and how the fact that these communities that these children grow up in and the responsibility that's placed on them to bear arms in order to protect themselves and their families is a real thing and very comparable to children who are child soldiers in other parts of the world. There are many differences. At the same time, as Heidi was talking about, when it comes to how our brains are wired and the fact that brains grow in an experience-dependent way, you take any developing brain and you expose it to a tremendous amount of chronic stress and trauma, it's going to impact brain development, no matter what country or region you grew up in. And the greater the amount of trauma exposure and adversity and stress, the greater the impact that's going to have on brain development. Oftentimes as clinical psychologists, we see the impact from a regulation standpoint. That's where we end up intervening, you know, given all the ways in which a child's brain has been impacted by chronic stress and trauma, they end up having a very difficult time regulating their behaviors and their emotions. And they tend to not, for example, trust the world around them, or to not have a, you know, as Heidi was talking about, another cognitive impact might be a sense of future orientation. You don't think about your future if your focus is on surviving every moment, right? So as clinical psychologists, we intervene more at the regulation level. But regardless, I think no matter what the context is, you're still seeing the same impact on brain development. But I would really encourage you, Bill, to look into Brad Stolbach's work, because he makes a very good case for comparing America's children who grow up in communities like, you know, he works in Chicago. So children who grow up in communities like in Chicago where they're riddled with gang violence, there is such a real parallel there that's worth thinking about.
Perfect, thanks.
Yeah, so Heidi, I'll pass it back to you on the second question.
Sure, I hope you'll jump in on that one as well. But if I understand right, the second question is a really good one as well about, we've talked about repatriation, reintegration. What about, you know, the many kids who will be kind of reintegrating to Syria and not actually going anywhere? And I would just say, you know, many of the challenges are going to remain the same, and some are going to be even more difficult. And the two that pop to mind, one is, you know, how do you implement a supportive psychosocial program in a country that desperately needs that infrastructure more broadly, not just for a targeted group. And that's, you know, that's also an issue in many of the other countries where repatriation is happening, but may be, you know, even more striking. there. The second part of it is that I think, in some ways, staying in the same place means you're surrounded by loss and trauma reminders, because you have experienced that particular ecosystem as intensely threatening. And so when we start talking about reminders or stressors in the kind of resettlement context that may contribute to an ongoing sense threat or lack of safety, I think that's only going to be magnified if children are continuing to be in the same ecosystem where they experience that kind of pervasive threat and danger. Emma, do you want to add?
Before, sorry, if I can, sorry. I wasn't talking about, and maybe the mic, because I understand I'm having problems. It's not children staying in Syria. It's coming back to North America or to Europe with their parents, but they have never lived here.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Right.
well,
They're not staying in Syria. They're going to come back to Western society, but they're not reintegrating because they've never lived here.
They don't know it. Yeah.
right. And so then that's where we pull on a lot of our refugee experience, where we're talking about kids coming into a culture that they've never known before, language challenges, kind of a whole novel set of adaptation to a novel culture. So all of that is, when we talk about core stressors for refugee kids, we talk about trauma, isolation, resettlement stress, which is sort of the basics resources that you need. But the fourth is acculturative stress, and those are not in order of importance. They're kind of four stressors that interact together to create challenges for refugee kids as they reintegrate. And that acculturative stress is going to be particularly intense for kids who don't share any kind of personal memory of, and some of them may have been born in the country but were too young to remember, so they have the acculturative stress will be significant. Our experience is that it's also very a stress that can be overcome relatively easily with the right supports around it, but there needs to be the awareness of what that's going to be like for the kids and how to support a family where you'll have different family members with different levels of acculturation as you bring them back.
Is this is their culture or the youth growing up in war taken integration? So some children didn't grow up in war, or they didn't participate.
Bio?
Yes.
My apologies for interrupting you. The connection is not really clear. Would you like to type the question?
I'll email it after.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Ian, I also saw you had a question.
Yes. Hello, Ian Bradbury here. Thank you very much for coming out, Heidi and Emma. It's great to hear your presentation. My team's worked for a number of years with the Yazidi population in northern Iraq, and we did work around the lost boys concept. I'm sort of curious as to how this model could be applied, say, in the consideration of an orphan who was initially kidnapped, no direct family, and was trained and actually participated as a fighter, who has now since been rescued, recovered, returned to the community, and is mostly living homeless right now. How could we use this model to establish or treat or address that kind of an individual?
And that I don't know if you're talking about a specific case or a kind of hypothetical group, but if there's any more information about like where that child is living, is it a foster family setting, and also kind of age, that would help me to kind of frame the answer a bit.
Fair. Okay. I'll give you a specific example. It is a group that we've worked with for a number of years. So a specific example, they're living in Camp 3. Right now they are 16. And they are with a foster family, but mostly they just run the streets of the camp with other boys like them because they've generally been rejected by the community. Mm-hmm. So I'm just trying to see how this model could be used and applied in a situation like that. It's one that we've been dealing with for years. So any ideas could possibly, you know, it's all great.
And can I ask, Emma, I hope you'll unmute so that we can do this together. Can I ask if there are behavioral problems that are being identified or kind of issues with these kids other than?
Yeah, very, very much so. Actually, you know what? It probably best. I'll just float it for now and as a consideration, and I'll send you a bit more information, and I'll send you my TED Talks on it as well.
Oh, I would love to see that. Great. And without going into the specifics, I think the way our treatment model would work would be you'd start with, let's say there's a particular child who was doing something disruptive and that was causing problems within the camp setting. You'd want to do a really thorough psychosocial assessment of the child, but also drill down into what's going on with those specific incidents. And you would be looking at what the context is leading up to it. You'd be trying to understand how that child was experiencing the moment right before they did that disruptive behavior, whatever it may be. And so that you could begin to piece together whether that child is, this is one of the things we have to ask is, you know, why is that behavior happening? Is it because the child is perceiving some threat and it's activating a survival system in their brains, which then manifests as, you know, some kind of disruptive behavior? Or is this actually a learned strategy that they're using because in a camp setting, if you're disruptive, you actually get a little more food or you get a little more power or whatever it is that you need, in which case that's a different kind of rationale for what's motivating that behavior. So we would be doing a really thorough assessment to try to understand that. And we'd also be looking and kind of assessing level of risk of that child's behavior. So is this a kind of disruptive behavior that could potentially injure the child or someone around them, or does it fall at a kind of lesser level? And then separately looking at the social ecology and saying, okay, what are the very real or significant perceived threats that the child is experiencing? What are the stressors that are impacting that child right now? And then you start tying it together. And usually what happens in a trauma response is you start seeing fairly predictably that some of those disruptive behaviors are a result of some of these kind of perceived or real threats the child's experiencing. And their behavior is coming out of an adaptive survival strategy, really. So what they're doing then is they're kind of possibly not very helpful, but their effort to kind of retain safety in a moment of perceived danger for them. And once you have piece together, okay, these are the threats that are particularly concerning for the child that seem to lead to these behaviors, and these are the behaviors that we most need to manage because they're most concerning, you can start working both to manage the threats as well as to manage the child's kind of identification of, oh, that's the thing that causes me to feel this way, that causes me to do this thing, and you build their skill set. So that's sort of a generic high-speed pass through how we would approach it, but you can see from the individual, we end up having treatment targets in both the social environment and with the child.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, I really appreciate that.
Sure.
Heidi and Emma, if you don't mind, I would also have another question with respect to the TSD. And I know you mentioned during your presentation that you still have not implemented it for children in former IS territory. I wanted to ask whether there are steps that are being taken for this to happen in the near future, and what are your next plans?
So we have a couple grants under review that we are hoping will come through, and that would allow us to work in a couple different, they're each in different contexts, to begin to implement some of these ideas. I've done training in Kosovo on the principles of the treatment model, but they have not, they have training in it, but they've not adopted a particular model in their work with the kids that they've brought back. So part of what we're trying to do is just introduce some of these concepts into the conversation now, as countries really are, COVID has slowed everything down, but I think there is going to be, some momentum in bringing kids back. And so we're trying to put the tools out in advance and have the dialogue in advance so that we could support efforts if people are interested. I know there are also parallel efforts around kind of more curriculum around how do you set up a multidisciplinary team. I believe IIJ is putting out a curriculum along those lines. And so there are other resources that this can kind of dovetail with, so that if a country was interested in putting together a more comprehensive multidisciplinary response, hopefully the tools will be in place for them to draw on.
Thank you very much. And I know that you were talking before about how it is important to primarily extract the children from the traumatic environment in order for him or her not to be continuously exposed to those triggers who affect his development. But I know that there are some discussions happening with respect to the opportunity of dividing children and mothers in the whole camp and other IDP camps and prison camps to protect the children from the type of negative influence that a mother radicalized to jihadi extremism may have on the child. And so I wanted to ask you if should something like that happen in that particular context, do you think that the TST could take place already in the camp?
Emma, would you like to respond to that?
So whether or not the full model could take place in the camp is one big question. I think that certainly there are practice principles that guide trauma systems therapy that I think could be infused into, social services that are happening within the camp already. TST as a model is a pretty significant model, and that's in part because, as Heidi was talking about, it requires major multi-sector service coordination that can be really challenging to have happen within a camp context for a multitude of reasons. But the model's emphasis on transmitting signals of safety to children and to families can be done, I think, at the camp level, and that can require a lot of education to practitioners who are in a setting like that on what it means to send signals of safety rather than to inadvertently send signals of carelessness and danger that happen all the time. And again, this is inadvertent. That doesn't mean that people are trying to do something bad or negatively impact a child or a family system, but it's really important when you're thinking about, how do I explain this? It's really, really important to be thinking about what has happened to that child. What were those child's experiences when thinking about how to essentially intervene with a child in a way in which you're communicating to that child that you're a safe person who's there to support and to help and protect that individual. This is where kind of knowledge of the context and previous experiences, as we've been talking about, is really, really critical, because I think so oftentimes people think they're doing good, right? That they're doing, that they're not doing harm, that they're really supporting a child, that they're doing good, when they forget that they're operating from their own sense of what is safe, their own lifetime experiences, rather than putting themselves in that child's shoes and what that child previously has experienced before they come in. And that's where I think, to Bill's point, if I understood it earlier too, you have some children who grew up in a context where, that this is all they knew. Violence is all they knew, as Heidi was talking about before. Danger is all they knew. And in many ways, if that's all you know, it's not even necessarily, quote unquote, that dangerous. It might be just chronically your reality. And what we think as friendly and warm and empathic and supportive might actually feel for a child initially more dangerous than not. And that's something we have to remember when we're thinking about how best to intervene. So all this to say, I think the TST talks a lot about signals of safety and ensuring that you're transmitting signals of safety in accordance with a child's lifetime experiences and frame of reference. And I think that stuff could be really valuable in a camp setting. I don't necessarily think that kind of the organizational components of the model would gain as much traction. You could also certainly do some of the skill development work that's embedded within TST in the camp setting, in the sense that you can teach emotion regulation skills. But to Heidi's point, you know, the model requires an assessment of the stability of the social environment that a child is presently in. And as we all know, our whole is not necessarily a stable and safe environment. So the model would recommend that you wouldn't necessarily move forward too much with regulation skill development. You're really focusing more on establishing a semblance of safety and advocacy for this child, organizing needed services where possible. To your point, Cecilia, about kind of separating a mother and a child, that's something where I would really be sitting there thinking about, is this because I think that this isn't safe? What's the consequences of doing something like that? You know, I have this idea of the mother and where the mother's at and her quote unquote negative influence on the child perhaps, but how is the child going to receive an action like that? Is the child truly going to see that as helpful and protective for his or her development, or is it going to feel incredibly frightening to lose the one person that he or she knows and is connected to in suddenly a new environment and a whole, you know? So I would be worried about those repercussions. But.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sarah, would you like to jump in here and say something with respect to what is the UN approach to, and what are the United Nations guidelines on separation of mother from the child, and what is that is being done in the best interest of the child? I know that the UN has recently published a paper exactly on this topic.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. So just as you mentioned, we are developing a global framework to address the question of third country nationals in Syria and Iraq. And it's a framework we are developing with 15 UN entities, and we are developing this together with UNICEF. So this framework is in development. The idea is really to translate the guidelines we have at the UN level to translate it at the national level, at an operational and technical side. So we are going to move forward with implementation soon. Regarding especially our question of mother and children, and what you said about the separation of the children from the mother. I mean, all the convention, for example, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, really call about the best interest of the child to not be separated from his parents unless it is assessed as necessary and for his own safety. So I think it's resonate a lot with the discussion you just had on trauma. What would be the best interest of the child regarding this separation, because we don't want also to create an additional trauma regarding this aspect.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Are there any other questions for Emma and Heidi?
I did see Bill had a question in the chat. I don't know if we should respond to that now or.
Yes, sorry, thank you. I have missed that. Yes, of course, Heidi, if you wish.
Okay, so I'll read the question first. Bill says, once children are back in the West, their adjustment difficulties can lead to increased chance of interactions with the police. Are there different approaches that you would recommend for police in dealing with refugee children who have experienced armed conflict? Yes, so I'll answer this question on a couple different levels. First, I think there's a much larger conversation to be had around trauma-informed policing, trauma-informed care. That's perhaps a particularly relevant conversation here in the United States right now. But certainly, I think an awareness of the fact that a child who's been traumatized may have one of those survival responses when they see a police officer, when they see the gun that in the holster, whatever it is, when they feel threatened. So that may trigger their fight, flight, freeze response kind of survival mechanism. And so, an awareness of the fact that that may very well play a role in how someone is acting and responding is, I think, critical. And there are initiatives to bring trauma-informed training to police forces, and there's been some really great work in that area. I would also answer it on a bit more of a specific level around refugees. So when we did our work with our research with Somali refugee adolescents and young adults, we asked them very specifically about their experiences with police, and we both quantitative and qualitative data collection. And it was an incredibly rich conversation with these youth, because there's quite a range of experiences, and many of them described experiences that are akin to abuse of power. Some of them described stereotyping and profiling that they believed the police were engaged in. But there also was a subset of participants who talked about experiences they'd had where police used their engagement as an opportunity to help kind of share country norms, do some teaching, do some kind of collaborative relationship building. And so a very concrete example that came out of one of our interviews was a youth who had hopped a turnstile to get on the T without paying for the fare. And the police officer, instead of taking a hard enforcement approach, recognized that youth didn't seem to be from this country and has been fully spoke with an accent or something, and pulled the youth aside and began talking to him about why he'd done that. This youth that's how it worked. You just kind of get on the train, you don't need to pay. And so the officer used that as an opportunity to share cultural norms, to shape expectations around law enforcement, and to really build a relationship. And you can see that transformed in many ways that youth's experience of authority. And police officers are often the kind of first level representation of our government to communities. That's who people interact with most directly. And so, as I presented in the slides, a sense of trust in government is enormously important in terms of reducing risk for violent extremism or attitudes in relation to that. So if we can help kind of community policing initiatives or other efforts, trauma-informed policing initiatives that help to shape interactions with community members, whether they be refugees or ethnic minorities, racial minorities, or community at large, those interactions are going to, in large part, shape how an individual experiences their government. So those are a couple thoughts. I'm happy to share that paper. We published a paper called "We All Have Stories" that discusses the youth's experiences of policing and our recommendations associated with that. So I'm happy to share that out if it's of interest.
Thank you very much, Heidi and Emma. Heidi,
sorry.
Can you hear me well? Yes, Sarah?
May I just add something regarding the aspect of guidelines? I wanted just to mention, I'm sure you're all aware of this, but last year we published a handbook on child returnees with the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism. It was an all-of-UN approach to this question. So there are answers regarding, there are specific guidelines regarding, the aspect of citizenship, what we just mentioned on separation and other critical aspects. And also we developed the key principles for the protection, repatriation, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of women and children affiliated with or linked to this phenomenon. So if you are interested, I can also share these documents with the group. Thank you.
Okay, today's meeting is concluded, and I wanted to thank infinitely Heidi and Emma for your incredible work and for your long-standing commitment to children well-being. I look very much forward to be in touch and to see what we can do together to continue to protect children affected by terrorism.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your time and likewise for the important work that you all are doing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heidi and Emma, and to the rest of you, and have a great morning ahead. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.